Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition's Human Trafficking Awareness Month presentation. Today, we will hear about sex trafficking and protecting Alaska Native women with Janelle Chapin.
Mind, how it's received into your body, your heart.
Did you hear that? Oh, okay. My name is Linda Thompson, and I work for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I hope you heard me when I welcomed you the first time. We're just going to do some short introductions, but today we'll conclude our series of 3 webinars that brought awareness across the nations on the issue of human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for welcoming us all. So to the folks here in Zoom land, to the folks who may be watching on our Facebook, as well as anyone who may be watching the recordings later, want to do my own welcome to everyone. My name is Jolene Engelking, and I am one of the 2 national training and technical assistance providers here at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition who focus on sex trafficking. I'm stepping in today for Rebecca Baylog, who created these wonderful learning environments we've had for the last couple of weeks. A little bit of housekeeping, as I have already said, we will both be here within Zoom and on our Facebook Live. Please feel free to chat in any questions that you may have. We'll be holding most of the questions until the end, where we can kind of really have a conversation with our presenters and kind of, just have a little visit about what we're learning and what we can really do to, further how we're thinking about working with survivors and what we're learning today. And so if anybody also has any kind of tech questions, please chat that in, particularly to me or to my coworker Angelica, who I'll turn over right now for a quick introduction.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much, Jolene, and thank you, Linda, for opening us up. My name is Angelica Allery. I am Membership and Outreach Coordinator at Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, or MIWSAC. We are coming to you live from Zoom and Facebook Live. So I'll be here doing some of the background tech stuff. So if you have any questions, or if you're watching from our Facebook Live, feel free to pop in a comment or a question, and we'll make sure to get those to our facilitators and our presenters today, so we can get those answered and just kind of talk a little bit about what's going on and how to stay connected. So thank you so much, and I will pass it on to Janelle.
Good morning. My name is Janelle Griffin Chapin. I'm calling in from Fairbanks, Alaska, and I'll give a second to Violet to introduce herself.
Yaketsutat. Good morning. My name is Violet Sunsmeyer, and I am calling in from Yakutat, Alaska.
Thank you for the opportunity today. So we're just gonna address sex trafficking long-term, from colonization to what it kind of looks like today. And then we're gonna focus more on protective factors today and things that we do to help our women and our men heal throughout our state. So we know that our people have been impacted greatly by trafficking since the beginning of contact. And so if we begin to look at that, they have been, I hear an echo, do you hear that? Okay, it's gone a little bit now. So they were used for both slave labor and sex trafficking from the beginning of time. So for fur trading at colonization, and it came from all different areas. So when we talk about that, We know that when they came and took our land, that they knew that if they got our women and they beat down our women's spirits, that was how they were going to defeat our people. And so when that doesn't happen, then our people stand resilient and strong and keep going. And so we've seen that throughout time in different areas. So throughout, in some areas it's through whaling, in some areas it was sea otter, for some areas it was for land, gold, just depending on what area and resource. And more modern times, we saw it impacted through the pipeline all the way up to the 70s. And now we see it in different areas through mining in Fairbanks and other areas of our state. We have mines all throughout Alaska, and some of our rural mines talk about, and some of our fishing communities also have canneries that come in, and they see some trafficking in those communities as well, and they talk about that. And so we like to make people aware of what that looks like when they come in. We also see the everyday sex trafficking that we like to educate people around, and we're starting to have more conversation than we've had in the past, which is very encouraging to us because it's kind of been a taboo subject to talk about in our communities. A lot of our communities were settled and colonized by religious areas. And so when Alaska was settled, let's see if I can do Tammy's thing. I don't know if you can really see it. So Alaska is kind of like a hand. And when it was divided up by religious groups, and depending upon where you were was how it was, which church took over that area. And that was dependent upon whether there were boarding schools or what that looked like upon contact. And so depending upon those areas, it may look different. And so when we talk about boarding schools in Alaska, that's only 1 or 2 generations ago for most of our families, as opposed to the lower 48, where it's a little further back. So when we talk about that, we're really only talking. So for example, in my family, only my mother went to boarding school. My grandfather was the first one in contact and went to school at home until, I believe, 3rd or 4th grade. And so depending upon where you were at, and I know more coastal communities had contact further, and they may have gone to boarding school 2 to 3 generations ago. Violet, feel free to jump in whenever you want to. So this is our more informal conversation around what trafficking may look like in our communities historically. So when we talk about, we know that when we think about the pipeline, it was from the top of the state all the way down, and we know that there was a lot of trafficking along those communities when that was established in the 60s as well. So we can look at different areas and different contacts as to what those timelines may look like throughout our state, and we can kind of see what areas have been impacted throughout our state based on that. And so when we're doing our work, we're talking about that, like what, because we do work really regionally and village based. And so we ask our communities, what does your historic contact look like? How has it impacted your community? And then that we begin to do our work around that so that they can look at how to heal their communities based on the historic context. Sorry, I need to take a drink. So, and today our trafficking looks really different because many of our communities are starting to get internet and cell phones. And so our kids are having more access to it than they have ever had before. And so we're hearing from our providers, our trafficking providers, that they may be, I think the average time that someone is contacted by someone looking to traffic someone when they hit Anchorage, which is our biggest urban community, is within 36 hours. They'll be contacted by a trafficker. And prior to COVID, I know that many of the people that were trafficking were looking, they would note the flights coming out of certain areas, some of our bigger hub areas, and they would come into the airports and they would wait for those flights to come in, and they would look for primarily women or younger men to target and make contact with them, because they would know that they may be more vulnerable in terms of looking for rides. They may not have as much knowledge about being in the city as other people. They may be more vulnerable. And we know that our women and our younger men are being targeted because they look more what they're terming as exotic. And so we're looked at as a point of origin where our people are targeted and they're taken out of Alaska to different points outside. And when I say outside, I mean outside of Alaska and lower 48 typically. So we are getting ready to work with many different providers in the next few months, launching some other programs working around trafficking. And that's going to look at a lot of different resources that we can provide. Right now, we have several agencies that we work with in our communities, and we do one-on-one with our tribes around trafficking when they come up with helping their women, and we do education around it. And so educating people like, what may trafficking look like? What do we need to teach our young women and our young men to be aware of when they're coming into town, to look out for? How do we teach them to be safe when they're going out into town, is what we call it, when they're coming out of a village? How to not to go out alone, what they're looking for in terms of messaging, what parents should look for if all of a sudden their kids are having more new friends, new items. How do we address that? Just beginning that conversation and how to start those conversations with your kids. So my kid, thanks to COVID and homeschooling, is pretty comfortable, and she's only 8. Like having this conversation because she sat in on a lot of webinars that were in our house last year. So we have these conversations in our house and with our teenagers, but not all houses are that open. So how do we begin to teach our kids to be safe? And so we're beginning a lot of those conversations where we wouldn't have had them a few years ago, because many of our communities, because of how sheltered in the religious aspects of colonization, were not in a place where they were open to talking about sexual abuse yet. And so we're beginning to mix in some of the sexual abuse conversations and the trafficking conversations as protective factors as we begin to address domestic violence. And so it's a slow integration and education process. Violet, do you have anything to add before I share the PowerPoint?
No, I agree with everything that you're saying. And growing up in rural Alaska, I can tell you, like, it was always so exciting to be able to go to the city. And I remember growing up and being able to walk from the hotel up to the mall, things like that. There were no cell phones back in those days. There was no social media, and it felt a little bit safe. And nowadays, I do not feel safe walking by myself, even a few blocks when I go to Anchorage now. And knowing that these people know what to look for, especially for people coming from rural Alaska into the big city, how vulnerable our people are and how important it is to get the conversations going and to get the word out there, what things to look for, how to protect yourself.
So I'm going to put on the PowerPoint. And when I do that, you're only going to be able to see our interpreters. And so Violet and I are going to disappear. Do you see that okay now?
We can, thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Violet.
Okay, so culture is our best protective factor and also one of our best healing practices. We have a lot of nonverbal communication as Indigenous people. We have a lot of facial expressions, such as eyebrow raising as a yes or I agree, squinting or frowning for I don't know or not sure, nodding. We're aware of others' nonverbal cues. We avoid eye contact as a sign of respect. We talk a lot with our hands. We have shoulder shrugging. We point with our lips and our forehead to give directions or answer questions. And we are culturally comfortable with quiet and long pauses.
So a lot of these movements are going to be culturally based and depend upon which region of the state you're from. And it's true for any of our tribes throughout the country. So when we think about it, like many of our tribes, and it has been an issue within our Western systems that we avoid eye contact as a sign of respect. It's also shown in Western culture to be a sign of disrespect to avoid eye contact. And so we see that when we encounter of how we address that. So we need to teach our providers that we do that as a sign of respect. And so we integrate these into our systems as well as we move forward. And we learn many things just through daily watching and interactions.
And so we are very comfortable with silence. In many cultures, responses are more thought out and take time and often tells a story. Many cultures learn by observation, and we are traditionally taught not to question or speak out. And we often are taught to think through reaction before acting. And we need to encourage our people to continue to speak out on social issues.
So you can see how some of these may seem like they don't go together, right? We're taught not to speak out, and now we're trying to teach our people to speak out against these issues. And so it's not come naturally for us to speak out against the injustices that are happening and when our people are harmed. And so how do we begin to do that when we are often taught not to speak? Or we're taught, like you can see this picture of my grandpa, his favorite thing to do was just sit on the river and watch it. It was that breakup. And he would just sit there for hours and just listen to the river crack and move and slam, and the ice would make all kinds of noise. And so those are the kinds of things that we were taught to do that would bring us peace. And so when contact happened and then those kinds of things were replaced with other things, we had to learn a new way to be. And so how do we do that and still learn to enjoy our traditional ways? So teaching our people to speak out when we're harmed doesn't come naturally. And so we do that by teaching language, because our languages don't have the words for harm. They don't have the words for domestic violence and sexual assault because they didn't exist in our cultures prior to contact. And if they did, our elders dealt with it And it never happened more than once, typically because people were banished or removed from communities, and you couldn't exist without your community in our harsh climates. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how we teach people to speak out as we move through.
Some examples of regionalized language. So we all have our different ways of expressing how we feel or whatever it is we're trying to communicate. So it might not always be exactly word for word interpreted the same. Some examples are, I'm doing bum, I am still trying, or I quit trying, I am not myself today, he is bothering me, they are acting funny. We have many different meanings for many things. There's so many different words, for example, like birds or weather. We are going to look in the woods means something different than they walked into the woods. One example that I have from my own experience is I was in a setting one time where I was around a bunch of young kids and I was changing a little one's diaper, and she had said she couldn't talk very well, but what she could say was, he tickled me there. And that was enough of a red flag for me to know that I had to inform the right people to make sure that this child was in a safe space.
So we need to begin to teach our people those types of languages, as well as teach our service providers the language that may be used regionally. So a couple that we really have that we've seen service providers turn away from is they're acting funny or they're bothering me, which in some areas could mean all the way from they're annoying me to they're molesting or raping. And so those are really big differences. And so a service provider could we've seen troopers walk away from cases where a young girl was being raped because they just thought, he's acting funny. That doesn't mean anything to a trooper unless they're familiar with the languages of that area and the regional differences. And so it's really important as service providers, we have an idea of our communities, and we teach our service providers as they come in how to work with our people. And some other examples that I found just working through the areas is Violet and I live in completely different areas. And on a call last fall, I was talking to someone, I was like, oh yeah, my family went into the woods for the weekend. And I meant they went hunting. And the woman freaked out because in their area, when you say they went into the woods, that means they passed on, they went on to the spirit world and they died. And she couldn't figure out why it was so calm. And so they had totally different meanings. And so it's important to know those things when we're working with people, because we're going to get different reactions. And so many of our cultural cues are built into our reactions. And that's how we're going to help our people when we're working with them. Things like, and because our people are so spiritual, birds are really important in our area. And although that may seem like it's a little far-fetched from what we're talking about today, they're really ingrained in different areas. For example, the owl in my area is, they bring news whether something's gonna happen to someone or someone's gonna die. In other areas, an owl is really a significant honor if you see or hear one. In other areas, a raven is known as a trickster. In my area, they may also bring news. You can see my little girl up there in the right hand corner, Lena Diggy. She loves, we call them Datsan, and she just loves to hear them talk. But in our family, even though ravens typically bring news, in my family, they don't, because there's a spiritual connection to them in our family. And so she really is tuned into that connection, because when she was little, something just clicked for her. She really watches and clues into ravens everywhere we go. So we never know what's going to click for
It was sent
an individual
yesterday.
person. Go ahead. And you can see, is that your little boy, Violet, with the eagle on him?
Yes, and so in our culture, ravens are one clan and eagles are the other. And so we have the highest respect and love for different things like that.
And this little girl on the bottom right here, this may be even an owl feather. She's from the Yupik region, which is further out from our areas.
Another thing that we have is connecting through touch. Our cultures show affection through hugs when greeting and leaving. Historical, multi-generational, and modern trauma impacts our comfort levels. Many interruptions, such as boarding schools and colonization of our cultural teachings, have happened. Many cultures separate into genders for socializing, learning, gathering, and hunting. COVID-19 has impacted our connections to each other. It has touched every aspect of our lives. And how will this impact us long term in regards to our cultural activities, our emotional and mental health, and our community gatherings to celebrate and to grieve?
So unfortunately, we're seeing many of those impacts right now, the longer we're stuck in this pandemic. Because our people are so used to just touching each other in every aspect. We greet each other with hugs, we leave each other with hugs, and now we're all of a sudden stuck in this pandemic for 2 years where we haven't been able to gather. We haven't hugged our relatives. We haven't gathered to share our food, which is so important in our culture because that's how you showed your love and that's how you cared for each other throughout time. Our foods were traveled and shared through our generations. And those are things that haven't been happening. Our families haven't been gathering to do subsistence. Many of our areas aren't getting the food that they used to get because of global warming impacts. So there's so many impacts that are happening and so many things lost right now. And some of them are a result of colonization. Some of them are a result of boarding schools. When we look at how our people are being impacted at this point, how do we begin to address it and heal our people? So we know that we're seeing more conversation happening around what happened at boarding schools right now. And we need to begin to address how to begin to heal our people from that. Because when our people were taken and put in boarding schools, we had one set of skills that we had gained in our families and our communities. And that's how we learned to interact and socially take care of ourselves. And those skills were all of a sudden replaced a lot of times with violence and harm. And so how do we look at that now and heal our people? Things like our mental health and an emotional health weren't things that we had to look at before colonization because we lived communally and we were in tune with each other. And now we're living individually and we have to check those on a regular basis. And that's become harder throughout COVID. And we haven't been able to check in with our people and find ways to connect. And so our people are suffering right now. Our grief has been disrupted. We have really important spiritual grieving practices that have been in place since time immemorial, and those aren't happening. And so we are having to find new ways to take care of ourselves. And if we don't have good coping skills because of the trauma that's been placed in our lives, how do we help our people?
English is a second language, so words get lost in translation, the depth of meaning, or modern words lack in our languages. There are barriers and challenges to written language, differences in speech patterns, volume differences, mixing up pronouns, regional accents, different worldview through our native languages. And our brain thinks in our first language and has to translate even if you have not spoken your language.
So you can see these pictures on here. These pictures of my grandparents, and their first languages were not English, and they were not US citizens when they were born. My mom wasn't a US citizen until she was 5 years old. And so our world looked very different here in Alaska, even one generation ago. So when we talk about these, and some of our areas are really blessed and lucky to have their languages still intact. And many of them are working very hard to revitalize their languages, because as Indigenous people, we see the world through that lens. Regardless of what your language is, I'm always gonna see the world as a Koyukon woman, mother and daughter and granddaughter. And so that's how I'm gonna think, and I'm gonna see my world. And so it affects everything I do, my speech patterns, my volume, whether I look at you when I'm speaking to you. Even here on the camera, you're going to see me looking down a lot because I'm not used to looking at people. So I know that in our communities now, we identify by pronouns a lot. And I personally don't use pronouns because I grew up with my grandpa as a big influence in my life, and he mixed up pronouns all the time. So it just wasn't a thing for me. So I just say I choose not to use them, but I respect how you identify. Just because I came from a language where it was mixed up all the time and it didn't have that emphasis. For example, snow has 7 different meanings, whether snow is wet, cold, crunchy, icy. So there's so many little nuances, but pronouns were just interchangeable because that was roles were placed on us in different ways at colonization. Because prior to colonization, your role was a little bit more fluid and you went with what your skill base was. And so those were ways that our people disjointed, like we were talking, like how it's been disrupted by boarding school and that kind of stuff. Ooh, my internet is a little bit unstable, it says. So they're all connected. Like when boarding schools happened, we got placed into gender roles, like men were placed in manual labor jobs and women were placed at desks or at home as homemakers. And those are very different roles than what we traditionally saw in our homes prior to contact. And we didn't live in single dwelling homes. We're going to talk a little bit more about that though.
So what is a protective factor? They can be skills, strengths, resources and supports, coping strategies. They help people deal more effectively with stressful situations and trauma. They reduce and/or eliminate risks to individuals, families, and communities. The impacts long-term effects on cultural or family groups.
So our protective factors were built in with as we grew up. So examples of that may be that you see the little boy being thrown up in the air. Well, we know that each parent or grandparent or aunt or uncle teaches a different role in our lives. And uncles play I know that this happens to be an uncle throwing up a little boy in the air. And uncles in our cultures play really important roles. They teach our boys how to hunt, how to be rough and tumble, how to toughen up and be out there and do things, if that's the role that they're going to be in their communities. And you can see the aunties wrapping this baby in love because that's the roles that our aunties play. This little girl learning how to fish or cut up fish because that's what she's learning how to do with her aunt and her mom in that picture. So we all have different roles and we're taught how to do things. And each one of these pictures is teaching a different coping skill that's going to come into play in that person's lives. And when our people were taken and put in boarding schools, those coping skills were disrupted. And many times they weren't replaced with healthy things, and we saw trauma impacts. And so how do we get back to where we're teaching these things again and helping our people?
Culture is our strongest protective factor. Our cultural values, it's our identity. Subsistence is a way of life. We all have a role, builds community and connection, and it forms our worldview.
So we all see our world based on how we fit into it. And prior to contact, we all had a place that we fit to make our community function and move forward in a healthy way. And now those roles look a little bit different because we're a little bit more individualistic than we were prior to contact. And so we're not as dependent upon each other. And so when we look at it, we need each other in different ways. And so how do we get back to those factors where we need each other and we're looking out for each other in healthy ways?
Our worldview is based in our language and culture and is rapidly changing with the language loss and modern changes. Self-sufficiency and collective we needed to survive. Collective versus individualism as of today, our purpose, our resilience, our gender roles not as defined as today, they were based on skills. When we know who we are, we can stand on our own and lead together.
So regardless of how we may live individually today, we still in our heart believe that we are collective people. We still gather when our people are born, when they're hurting, when we're grieving. We still play, we are still tied to our lands and our connections to the water, to our animals, to gathering. And so when we think about that, those are what make us who we are. And those are the connections that strengthen us. And those are the skills that we need to teach to our children wherever they fit in there. And it may look different. Like one of my children loves to bead. She's learning how to do it. She's only 8 years old, but that's her connection. The other one loves to play hockey and wants nothing to do with my beads. So how do we look at that and connect them and build their communities and still be connected? And so as we look at where we're at, whether we're an urban setting or rural setting, we have to build those connections for our kids. And a lot of them are not going to have those connections the way they may have looked for us. But what's important is that they're getting those healthy connections in their relationships to their families, to their community, to make them strong and resilient and know where to go and know what to look for and to seek help when they need it and have a community.
Yes, so subsistence is our way of life. We live off of the land. We respect and we connect to the land and the water. We have respect for all animals. We practice ethical harvesting, meaning taking no more than needed. We provide for others in our family and in our community. We make sure all people are fed, especially our elders. Traditional healing, foods, and medicine. our traditional foods are very much healing for our bodies and our minds. And the medicine that we make from it is something that is very important to us. It feeds our souls. And while we are practicing our subsistence way of life, we are teaching each other and we are working together.
So that's a picture of a Yukon king salmon, and that was our main subsistence activity, that and moose. And that's not something that our people are even able to do right now because the numbers are so low, and that has drastically impacted everything. And although our food security is a major impact on our life, our communities began to not be able to subsist this year on fish, we began to worry what that may look like for families, because we knew their homes were going to have less food. We knew with less food security, there could also be more violence because families were going to feel more stressed. So for us, subsistence goes so much deeper than just feeding our souls, our body, our spirit. It's just so deep. When we think about this work, it affects every aspect of it. And so although this is what we love to do and what we were taught to do, it affects our safety in every aspect.
So building community and connections, our physical health was in the form of traditional games, subsistence gathering, and our endurance in those two areas, our spiritual health with the grieving process, the healing process, our resiliency, and our mental well-being. Social issues have changed this.
So we've talked a lot about how our lives have changed and we're more sedentary. We're not living off the land as much as we used to. Our grieving has changed since COVID and how that's affecting us. Our well-being has changed. We know we're having to find different ways to cope, different ways to take care of ourselves. And it's a real stress factor that we're feeling throughout our whole country right now and our whole world. But as we look at it as service providers, we have to look at it on a more macro level of how we can help the people just in our area that we're at. And so think about some areas that we can talk about when we start the discussion a little bit about that. And we'll talk about some of the ways we may be doing it here. And it's going to ebb and flow depending on your COVID levels and safety to be able to do it.
And so we all have a role, we have a purpose, gives us belonging, a sense of belonging, connection. We focus on the collective well-being, not individual well-being, and it takes everyone to live off the land.
So as we're living more individually in our communities, how do we build these connections to each other? So maybe it's we include our elders when we go berry picking. Maybe it's if they're not able to go because they're not able to safely be in our vehicles because of COVID. Maybe we bring them berries. Maybe we bring them fish. We look at different ways that we're able to safely integrate everyone into our practices the way we are living now, because it's so different. We know that our people have lived through pandemics before, so our people are resilient, but we began hearing elders talk about what pandemics look like in their times, because there are some of our elders in different areas that were alive during the flu pandemic here in Alaska. at the time this pandemic hit. And so some of them were greatly traumatized when this began to happen again. And so some of them may have just, our communities did a really good job of locking down initially with because of that. Now we're seeing some of the highest rates in the country for the second time. And we're seeing fatigue, but initially we saw a lot of protective factors in our communities doing really well. So we know that we are able to connect and at the same time provide for ourselves and take care of our people.
So there are some barriers to services. Those can be the travel cost, the shipping cost, historical shame and guilt, confidentiality, safety delays and law enforcement response time, health services not ready for access, and language and communication barriers.
So I love this picture because it shows not only how we are connected to our land, but it also shows the vastness of what we may face sometimes when we live where we are from. Sometimes we don't have law enforcement. Many of our communities don't have law enforcement, and sometimes it could take several days, and I've heard of even weeks, for law enforcement to respond to our often life-threatening or even murder investigations. And so we know that our communities are responding and taking care of themselves in ways that they have been since forever, because that's what we have to do. We know that we're going to do it, and we're going to continue to do it. And so how our job here is helping our communities to build those responses, to help them build the best system they can within their own communities. And sometimes that's going to include outside services, and sometimes that's not, because we know that oftentimes our weather and limited resources are going to impact the ability to do that.
And we should not have to choose our homes based on access to services. We are connected to our lands and water, our strength and spirituality come from our culture and connections.
So our people are just so greatly connected to everything. This is an example of the Yukon River from my grandpa's house. And everywhere I go, I put my feet in the Yukon River, because that's what just restores my spirit and makes me feel connected to my home. This is a number for Strong Helps Native Hotline. They also have a chat feature as well. This is information. Sorry, Violet, I just took over automatically.
You're good.
This is our contact information. So,
And Janelle,
Mhm.
Sorry, I was just going to add in that since COVID has hit and the rate of violence has increased and people are stuck in unsafe situations, that social media has sort of been a blessing in that way, and people reach out or they text when they don't think that they can make a phone call, or they send messages. And so these places also have Facebook pages that you can follow and reach out to as well.
Yes, thank you. So you see all of our social media sites here. Oh, it doesn't look like our Instagram is on here. We're not super active on Instagram, but our Facebook is on here, our mailing lists, our website. I'm going to stop screen sharing and we're going to open for discussion.
Janelle, I wasn't sure if you were going to, this is Jolene, if there were a few questions that kind of came in, do you want to do those first, or were there guided questions that you, all right, I'll read the first one. Regarding English as a second language, okay? Are you finding that many victims of trafficking or other crimes in Alaska need interpreters in order to either engage with a service provider or communicate, either formally or informally?
So it's going to depend on the area that they're from. Many of our areas don't need them. Some of the vast majority, I would say 40 and under, are going to have English as a language. They may need some interpretation of like slang that an advocate could provide, but not actual language, unless they're being brought in from another country for some of the other sites, the work sites.
Thank you for that. I think, yeah, I think it's hard. And I think that that is something that it's common kind of throughout. And the one thing it's harder to almost provide interpretation for are some of those, the non-verbals, or for the just the different ways of communication, right? So not even the words themselves, but how are we really connecting and building relationships with folks? And I think that's something that is, I think, universal all across, Turtle Island. So another question that came through was, how do you address historical shame? We're talking about, culture as a protective factor, but for many communities and for many individuals, there is this deeply embedded historical shame. So how have you found to maybe balance that or to counter that?
Violet, you can jump in whenever you want to.
Okay.
So
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just have actually a very recent brief example. So I'm going through the Rural Human Services Program, RHS, up at Fairbanks, and we talk about intergenerational trauma and shame, and learning from the elders that we actually have in the classroom who have been through boarding schools, who have experienced trauma that was passed down from their parents, whether it was the choices that they made because of that trauma in their lifetime, and how it has passed down onto their own kids and grandkids. And my father was, he went to boarding school, as well as his mother. And in my own family, there has been a tremendous amount of intergenerational trauma. My dad was also a Vietnam War vet. At a very young age, and came home to not be welcomed at home, became homeless, became an alcoholic, struggled with addictions, and he overcame all of that eventually. And just a few nights ago, I was talking with him and sharing with him about what I was learning about intergenerational trauma up at school. And he was so shocked. He's like, people are teaching about this, people are learning about all of this. We never talked about it, and they didn't have the resources back then or the awareness. And now we're getting to that stage. And he told me that he carried so much guilt and shame for what he feels like he passed down onto us, his children. And I explained to him that we also learned about addictions. And I told him, I said, Daddy, you struggled with those addictions, and it was simply your coping mechanism at the time. You did the best you could with the tools that you had. And people with addictions are often viewed as weak, or that they don't love their family enough, or they're willing to lose all of this over here to chase that addiction. But in reality, they are some of the strongest people, because they are fighting to survive and escape this feeling of trauma. And I told him that. And I told him too, I said, look at us, you have 6 kids who are off trying to do that the best that they can. And we're all good people, and your grandchildren are in college, and you also passed on all of the tools we needed to make it and to be good people. So don't forget that either. And so I'm excited to learn more about intergenerational trauma in Alaska specifically, but also how to turn around and use that and help trauma survivors, and to help break the cycle and to get back to our traditional ways and connecting people and having those good things to look back on and carry forward.
Thank you so much for that. I think that it can be just, it's so complicated sometimes how the different parts of our identity and our family and all those things that we carry with us, and how we are we're always just working on healing ourselves as we're working on, healing the generations that are to come. And so I find it to be a difficult conversation to have sometimes, but so important. There was one other question that had came in, and it's pretty tangible. If you know someone who is a victim of trafficking in Alaska, where would you encourage them to call to get help?
So we have a couple agencies that we work pretty closely with. Based in Anchorage is primarily where our resources are right now. And depending upon the age of the person, we often will reach out to law enforcement for help. If they're under 18, law enforcement is pretty helpful in the response sometimes. We have contacts with different law enforcement agencies depending upon the circumstances. As with everywhere, our families do a lot of the work themselves on social media and searching and looking, unfortunately, themselves too. We do have a resource that we work a lot with called Priceless that works with adults in Anchorage. And then we also have Covenant House that works with, I believe it's under 24, I want to say off the top of my head, with trafficked and vulnerable adults or children under 24.
Thank you so much for that. There was one more question that popped in based on the delayed response from law enforcement. Do you have any recommendations on how to deal with a person being abducted, assaulted, or sex trafficked if there is no law enforcement response?
So typically, if someone is the way we look at sex trafficking, like with multiple partners in a community, it's going to be an urban community and there is law enforcement, they're going to be in a hub where there is law enforcement. So how do we get law enforcement to respond? But oftentimes in our rural communities, there's trafficking happening and we know it, but it may be happening as survival sex. It may be happening as they're being traded for drugs or alcohol by their partner. They may be trading themselves for drug or alcohol for survival or for a place to stay or live. And those are going to be addressed differently than if someone is being trafficked, right? Because if someone is needing somewhere to live, we're going to begin to look at that stability that they need for that versus someone who's actually truly being trafficked because they need different resources. And here in Alaska, I would say it's just in the last few years that we're truly beginning to address trafficking at a better response.
Is there a state law about human trafficking in Alaska? And have any tribes developed their own tribal codes specific to that?
We do more federal work than we do state. And I have not seen any of our tribes develop tribal codes. Most of our communities are rural. We do have a few that are on road systems, but most you can only get to by plane. In the wintertime, you can get by snow machine, and in the summertime, you can get to by boat. But the vast majority are by plane. Off the top of my head, I can't. We are a public law 280 state, so we can't really address felonies, and trafficking would be a felony.
You for that. Before we open it up, there's just one kind of question that had been kind of bubbling on my mind on when we're thinking about, culture being a protective factor. Have you developed any strategies or tips on how to really engage with culture when we're sometimes meeting with people for just a short amount of time, especially for folks who are being trafficked who, I don't know if it's the same in where you are, but sometimes we're only seeing people for, like a short amount of time, and then they might, we might not see them for a while. And have you found ways of engaging in culture and using those protective factors in like short-term crisis work? It's okay if the answer is no.
I was just giving Violet a second to see if she was going to respond or not, because she's got a delay and I couldn't tell if she was thinking or pausing or. So sometimes our internet is not the best. Even here in the city, I am on a MiFi and I still have delays. So our people really connect through food. And so we have really been looking at trying to find ways, and this is new because one of our new programs is going to be connecting to our trafficking programs in Anchorage, because we've primarily done rural work and now we're branching out into urban work. And so now we're going to try to see if there's ways that we can support our more urban work through that. And so some of the ways we were talking about with one of the youth programs was something as simple as putting out a Facebook post like, hey, if you have extra subsistence food, can you drop it off to this area so our kids have access to their foods? We've done simple things like we have bead kits available so that if you bead, you have a connection and access to beads. There is a program that we are working with in Anchorage, which again is our most urban city, and it is developing and teaching skills so there's been a men's program for a long time that teaches skills in crafts and then helps people sell it. And so now they're developing a women's program, and that program is also going to have advocacy skills attached to it and outreach. So it's a developing piece of what we're doing because we haven't done a lot of urban work until recently.
Yeah, I used to do primarily urban or rural work around, sexual assault response teams. And so now switching into urban trafficking, it's a different dynamic. And urban can mean a lot of different things, but it's wherever that hub is, right? For people, where people kind of gather from all over. And it is unique when you're thinking about that culture parts that come into it, because you're sometimes having people who come from so far away, right? And who may be similar in some ways culturally, but there are those unique differences that come from, tribe to tribe, community to community. And I think that adds this extra layer when working in urban spaces. So I just wanted to note that. The final question before we can open it up is, do you have any statistics that you may be able to share or know about sex trafficking or missing and murdered specific to Alaska?
So that is one thing we've continuously struggled. We know our rates are extremely high. I see Tammy on here, but I don't know that she would have those at her access either. She probably just hung up when I said that.
I knew she was going to pick on me a little. I was thinking about changing my name.
I don't have that report right here on my desk, though, is all I was thinking. We know our rates have been really high, but data has been an issue that we've continuously faced.
This is Tammy Truitt-Giroux. I'm the executive director with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and I'm very fortunate to be able to work with Janelle and Violet. And so, you know, I think this is an ongoing question, I think potentially in most areas, wherever we live in America. Why, how, and who? And how did we get here? And so I think the most important thing that we have to remember in Alaska is that the education piece has even been very challenging in terms of people don't always identify as being trafficked people. You know, I mean, a lot of people are in survival mode through whatever types of trauma or experiences their lives have and where they've led themselves or are at the moment. And so with a really, as Janelle's talked about, we're really trying to work with a couple of programs, particularly in Anchorage, to help with meeting needs of people who we know are in situations that are traffic situations, in order to help them then go on to more safety or whatever that looks like for them. You know, we can never determine what a person's safety or what is going to be their reality. But what we can do is then offer things that are non-judgmental, non-threatening, but also then hopefully and potentially are helping to guide someone's decision-making, so to speak. And so I think that the important piece in Alaska is that data is very non-existent. I mean, there's stories that go back so many years. So many of us and our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents know about people who have just, they think they walked away, but probably something happened to them that was, you know, whether it was a homicide or whether it was a, you know, someone just disappeared. Because we also have that whole issue of when you're in dangerous situations, some people literally need to disappear. And so that is a struggle we have in conversation, particularly when we're trying to set up laws for protection, which Alaska doesn't really have. And I think that when we talk about the whole idea that how can this be a problem if we don't have the numbers to prove that it is a problem? Well, traditionally, data has always been a challenging experience because our data is used against us so often. And so I think it's important to realize that we are in all of the conversations that are going on in trying to help figure out what it can look like in terms of the protective type of factors here in Alaska. I know it's a kind of a roundabout way of not directly answering your question, but I suspect that a lot of us are in that same boat. So thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.
And so, wow, my brain just got really tired right now. I apologize for that. Did anybody have any other kind of questions for us presenters, or did something bubble up for you, Violet or Janelle? So if you want to speak, please just unmute and we can have folks answer.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lestina Salmerdassi. First of all, I want to say thank you to the presenters today. And to whoever that last lady was that was talking, what struck me about what you said was about the data, how they oftentimes use that against us. I think I can kind of grasp a little bit of what you mean by that. But I was just wondering if maybe you could explain it a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think that oftentimes I know that data can go a lot of different ways. And oftentimes when there's data being used, it's about our statistics. For instance, in Alaska, we have 16 to 19% of the state population is Alaska Native. And of the state population, the Alaska Native population, the murder rates are the highest, incarceration rates are the highest, all of the things that we don't want to be the highest at we are. And that has never been something that has helped motivate the state of Alaska and some of the resources of the state to really help tribal communities change the circumstances that data is being collected under. The fact is oftentimes tribes aren't even asked if they can utilize that data. So tribal people are being utilized in these types of statistics, yet let's go back and find the statistics for, here's a good example. There's a misinformation that a lot of Native people in Alaska are alcoholic, maybe across the nation. But if you really wanted to do a statistical survey, you would know that a good 60% of Alaska Native people haven't ever drank or used alcohol or drugs. But because of where that data is, how that data is being used at that state level, whether it's coming through the child protection systems, the jail system, forensic systems, you know, if that data was actually disseminated properly, I think we'd see a different story. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that we also need to be able to, if we're going to have data collected, let us do it and let us decide what is important.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I got me thinking about the MIWSAC movement, how oftentimes when they collect that data, they can't report certain numbers because they said there wasn't a crime committed or there wasn't like extenuating circumstances. And how do we know if this person just didn't walk away? When some family members believe that, no, this is not like them, they wouldn't just walk away from their family. So that's what triggered those thoughts of mine, but thank you for explaining that.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for our presenters? We did have one other question that came through, and that was about in connecting specifically around sex trafficking, but with all survivors. Do you do any sort of street outreach, or what does connection with survivors look like that?
So we are primarily TA providers to our technical assistance providers to our tribes. So we are giving the street outreach programs in Anchorage the tools to connect culturally is how we've been helping right now, to make sure, because they are non-Indigenous programs. And so we're making sure that they have the tools and the resources to connect with our people. Because there is 1 or 2 programs now that are starting to do the work, and so they're working together, but we're just making sure that they have those and they have the connections and know the services in the area. But we primarily serve tribes.
Thank you so much for that. Another question that came through are there any interventions that you have seen or feel are effective when it comes to prevention of sex trafficking, particularly like within your communities, or is that something that is still a growing understanding?
It's so hard. It's so hard. Like, we've seen several families that we've worked with, and then you get them home and then their trafficker gets them again and they come back into the urban areas again. So it's just primarily prevention, talking. So one of the big things we're doing now is, since COVID, we've been doing a lot of education over just like this. So this is, we haven't provided, you'll see that we struggle a little bit in doing this PowerPoint because it was a different format for us. But we've been doing RTA and our education virtually for 2 years now, pretty much. We have been able to have one face-to-face in 2 years. So we've been trying to do a lot of education around internet safety. We're trying to get those out to parents. One of our new programs is going to be getting it out to tribes and hopefully into schools soon, because we know that our kids as young as 7 and 8 are seeing and having access to pornography on internet and games they're playing. So the younger we can give them access to safety, the more likely we are to have interventions prior to getting trafficked. Because we know once they're in that lifestyle or have been contacted by a trafficker, the harder it is for them.
Yeah, I wish there was an easy answer when it comes to that prevention sort of thing. I wish that we'd have some kind of model that just seems to be, you know, applicable across the board, but especially when we're talking about some of that, like the social change aspect of it, is so hard to begin with. And there's amazing avenues that have come with this digital world that we live in right now, but it is harder when you're not able to, you know, as you talked about earlier, sometimes, you know, have food with people or to be in ceremony or to be in space with people even. And so I think that we're all doing everything that we can, and we need to just keep at it sometimes, right?
Just finding small ways to connect with people on a daily basis.
Anything to add, Violet?
I can just share that in my own experience with trauma, that coming back to my community, I can easily see now how much our connection to the land and the water and one another is one of the best things for people to heal and to be able to feel that sense of belonging again and purpose. And you get all of that from the people that you surround yourself with. So the more that we can have these conversations, as hard as that they can be, and do our best to connect with one another and learn to be vulnerable, because we are taught not to talk, speak out, or speak about ourselves or draw attention. But learning how to do that and sharing the message that these things are not okay and that there are resources out there to help one another. And it's, you know, it's not easy, but I can see changes happening, and I'm thankful for this opportunity that we have to share with you all. So I'm going to basi.
And we are so thankful for both of you being here and sharing your experience, your thoughts, your everything about your community. We have a couple minutes left, so I do want to, are there any lingering questions, thoughts, comments from folks?
Sorry, I don't have my
All right, well. Oh, Eileen, I think you have your hand raised. If you'd like to unmute, there you are.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for all your contributions. I was a nurse for many years, and I'm part of the organization, a member of, it's called HEAL, Health Education Advocacy and Linkage, with sex trafficking. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it's www. I can type it in, healtrafficking.org. And they've actually expanded almost worldwide and trying to find different best practices. And they aren't natively focused, but they're trying to meet the cultural needs of all different areas. And one of the things that they're doing is trying to educate the emergency rooms and hospitals. So when, say, somebody goes in for an OB exam or somebody goes in with an injury, and how to best assess people to see if something's going on. And they do a lot of things, but just to throw out there, if there's anybody that's interested in that particular organization, it's really quite amazing. Like it blows me away sometimes with some of the ways that they're doing, whether it's surveys or assessments or different kind of approaches for evaluation. And I think that across the board, many communities and many states and many countries are still finding it difficult because a lot of it is hidden activity. So there are definitely struggles and obstacles, with sex trafficking in general. But I just thought I'd let you know about that. And I do wonder, do you know if there's any intervention or any communication, say, with your organizations and emergency rooms? Because you just said schools, which is excellent. But like doctors' offices and counseling offices, or if there's anything like blanket that you try to outreach to those different organizations as well. I'm guessing that you do some of that, but just a question. Thanks.
So one of our new areas of funding right now that we are in the process of developing is actually with Indian Health Services and sex abuse. And so that's one of the areas that we're looking at trying to develop right now, and should be coming out as well in the next, I want to say, month and a half, 2 months. It's something we've always done in our smaller rural communities. That information gets out. They're invited to all of our trainings that we do in rural areas. But like I said, we haven't done a whole lot of urban work. And I do suspect that as we branch out to this urban work, that we will be working with the bigger hospitals and getting more information to them. But as we've done the urban work, we've always invited our health aides and our community providers into and we're beginning to look at how that's going to look in urban areas now. We're really growing just in the last few months. So I'm not trying to put you off when I say our programs are really developing. We have, like, I want to say 5 new programs in the process of coming out in the next couple months.
That sounds exciting and exhausting at the same time.
It is. It's very exciting and very tiring.
Labor intensive. And it's just, when you start with initiating programs and outreach and this, it can become a real lot. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing when we get fully staffed and we have everyone on board. It'll be amazing.
All right, I think we are winding down on time right now. Eileen, if you wanted to put that website that you were mentioning within the chat, that would be wonderful. But I wanted to say thank you. I'm going to hand it on over to, I was going to say my buddy Linda. I mean, she is my buddy, but that just felt like a very weird term to call her that. But I just wanted to say thank you. And just as a FYI for folks, we will have the recording available. We're still trying to figure out where we're going to be housing that, but it is also going to be live on our Facebook as well. And so people can watch the recording there. And if we aren't getting the other version of the recording out in a timely manner, please just reach out to any of us here at MIWSAC and we can get that to you. So, Linda.
We would like to thank everybody for their participation, and all of those questions are really, really important, as are all of the answers that were shared. I want to thank you for all of the work that each and every one of you do to make your communities safer. It is not easy work. And during a pandemic, it is extremely challenging to stay balanced. So I want to encourage you to drink your water, to use your medicines, to say your prayers, and to be good to yourself as you go about your day and your work week. Also remembering sometimes a lot of us, um, don't hear anybody say thank you sincerely, but at least when I did everyday advocacy, it wasn't a lot of thank yous. That wasn't what we did it for. We did it because we love our people. So I want to tell you thank you for everything you've done and for the sacrifices you've made, the sleepless nights, the headaches you've endured on behalf of other people, and for the loss of time with your own family. Please take good care of your health. Reach out for help and support. If somebody's on your heart and mind to contact, please do that. Sometimes that is the way that we get the support that we need. Somebody comes into our mind and we reach out, whether through phone or email, and make a connection with support. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, ASL. Thank you to Angelica, who was managing the Facebook. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your wisdom, your PowerPoint, and your work. Thank you, Tammy Giroux, for sharing another aspect of Alaska and the work that is being done every single day. I've spent a lot of years with Tammy on across the nation, and the advocates, a lot of us, we're going to be advocates even when we don't have the title anymore. It's the work of, it's sacred. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be seeing you again when we have a webinar Wednesday. We have some other training events coming up. Stay up to date on our Facebook page or subscribe to our membership. It's free and there are benefits to that, including lots of resources and information. And we have a Facebook page that is for membership only. And if you need anything, we have posters and printed materials. Please look at our website, www.MIWSAC.org. And a lot of those are printable, but we can also share by sending them out to you. So thank you so much for your time. It is appreciated.